The Woodrow Wilson Center, for a few of you who might be new to the center, is an official memorial to Woodrow Wilson. Around since '68, when Congress set it up as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for exactly bringing these worlds together. The Environmental Change and Security Program is younger. We're a 12-year-old program trying to do that in the areas of environment, development, health, population, and then understanding them in broader foreign policy, security policy context. So Peter's actually a contributor on a number of those topics in addition to water, whether it's climate change or particularly some of the environment, natural resources, scarcity, abundance, and conflict issues, which is another big portfolio that we have here at the Wilson Center. I want to say a word of thanks to him, too, because he has been, from the very beginning, a supporter, contributor, advisor on something we have here called the Navigating Peace Water Initiative here at the Wilson Center. And Peter has been instrumental in helping us in the success that we've had. He's been a tremendous supporter and really a guide in that work. And so we hope you will avail yourself of some of the outcomes of those efforts as well. But we're here to talk about the World's Water 2006 and 2007. Peter's presenting it here in Washington for the first time. I urge you to get a copy of the book at the table out front. You will know that Peter is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, that he's recently elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And really, it's a go-to person on these issues, so I don't think I need to really say any more. He's based in Oakland at the Pacific Institute, an institute that he co-founded some years back. We're pleased that he's joining us. He's got two august audiences today. We had to make a quick switch because of the weather outside. His plane to New York tonight has already been canceled, so we got him on the train because we wouldn't want him to miss the opportunity to share the stage with the likes of Jay-Z and Beyonce and other esteemed folks, MTV president and such, at the UN tonight, where they're doing a big premiere and a big gala and such. And Peter will have good things to say there as well. But we're giving you a little more time than the 3 minutes you'll have up there, and we look forward to your comments, Peter, so please.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I don't know how many of you have kids or teenage kids. I have two teenage kids, and finally, the idea that I might be in the 100 meters from Jay-Z and Beyonce has raised me in their eyes far beyond grumpy dad or whatever, however they tend to normally think about me. So, whereas I actually had to download some of Jay-Z's stuff to listen to. Let me thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and especially Jeff for hosting me. Jeff thanked me, but Jeff does a great job, and he's a pleasure to work with. And is this the third release of the World's Water? We have 5 volumes, but 3 times every 2 years, the Woodrow Wilson Center has hosted a talk to talk about critical issues in water, where we are, where we're going, and it's really because of Jeff, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about 10 years of the world's water. Water is a huge topic, as I'm sure you all know, and I'm just going to touch on a few critical issues in this talk. I'm not going to go into great depth on things, but I'd like to really give you a sense of what's going on. I guess there we go. There are 5 volumes. So this is a biennial report. It comes out every 2 years. So it's been 10 years since we started at the Pacific Institute to do this. I should also thank very explicitly Island Press, who's published this from the beginning. Todd Baldwin, my editor there, has been very supportive throughout the entire process. I would note Chuck Savitt, who's the publisher of Island Press, is here today. Island Press publishes the best environmental books there are. It's what they do, and they do it really well. And I just should say give a special note of thanks to them. I would also note that each volume of the World's Water is a little different. There are different subjects in each of them. The books, if you don't know them, are laid out with chapters on critical issues and then data sets on water, widely ranging. And the chapters are different each time because the subjects change each time. And so if there isn't something you're interested in this one, there might be something in a previous one. We don't talk about agriculture much in this volume, but there's a chapter on food in a previous volume. And I'll talk about the current volume in a moment. I would note my name seems to be getting smaller and smaller on the book cover each year, but there's a reason for that. And that is that I have co-authors now. I have a number of people who help me every 2 years, different people who write chapters, who collect data, who vet data, who understand problems with data and information, and I couldn't do it without them, and so it's important to acknowledge them. But you only have me, you don't have them. Okay, so I tried to think about 10 years ago, what was the world like? We had a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, and we all know how well that worked. I don't even remember who was in the World Series 10 years ago, which shows maybe where my head is, but somebody in the audience probably does it. But in the world of water, 10 years ago, there were billions of people without access to basic water services. We had deteriorating natural ecosystems because of human use of water. I would argue little public awareness, nationally and internationally, about water issues at all levels. Ongoing disputes and violence over shared water resources, no real coherent U.S. international water policy, and no real coherent U.S. national water policy. And so where are we today? Well, one could argue, and if I went by too fast, the only thing that's changing is the date. One could argue that not much has changed. A lot of these things are still true. We still have billions of people, almost the same number, without access to adequate water supply and sanitation, despite a lot of effort. Ecosystems are still shortchanged when it comes to water. There's little public awareness about these things and so on. But I would actually like to argue that some things have changed. Quite a few things have changed. I would say there's a growing public interest and awareness in water. 10 years there's been a remarkable discussion at a lot of different levels about water issues in local communities all the way up to the United Nations. And the fact that somebody like Jay-Z, who's a rapper, very well-known, respected, head of Def Jam Records, is interested in water, became interested in water during his Africa tour. And MTV has done a half-hour video on water problems in Africa that they're going to be showing to their audience, which is a different audience than typically hears about this. Celebrities, but politicians, there is a growing interest in water, in part because I think of the understanding of the connections between water and all the things we care about. More and more communities are getting involved in water. There are new efforts at ecosystem restoration. We're spending a lot of money to restore ecosystems that we damaged because of human use of water. Billions of dollars in the Everglades, billions of dollars in California. The country of South Africa is committing water for natural ecosystems, which is a remarkable thing. And in fact, it's a commitment in their constitution. We learned with Katrina part of the cost of destroying natural wetlands, part of the human cost. And so there is a growing awareness of this, and there's a growing effort at least to try and understand how to do the things we want to do with natural ecosystems. We've adopted the Millennium Development Goals. The United Nations and the nations of the world have adopted a set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals to tackle the broad problem of poverty. And there are many Millennium Development Goals, but 2 of them are devoted to water. And they are to reduce by half, by the year 2015, the proportion of people without access to water supply and sanitation, safe water and adequate sanitation, the way they define it. It's an enormous goal. It's very, very difficult. I don't think we'll meet the Millennium Development Goals for water, although we have a shot at meeting them for water supply. I think it's going to be really difficult to meet them for sanitation. And even if we did meet them, I would note by 2015, we're only reducing by half the proportion without access to water supply and sanitation. It's not the ultimate goal that we must have, and that is to reduce the number of people without adequate water supply and sanitation to 0. Nevertheless, we have explicit targets, and efforts are being made to reach them, and that's new, and that's good. There has been recently some effort to review and assess U.S. water policy. There is the Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act that was passed in a bipartisan fashion by the U.S. Congress to attempt to increase the amount of money spent internationally on water issues. I would argue there's not been a comparable reassessment at the national level. And I think that's a gap, and I think it ought to be addressed in the coming years. And I may come back to that. We've rethought to some degree over the last 10 years the role of economics, the way we price water, the way we subsidize things that affect water, like the growth of certain kinds of crops that demand a huge amount of water. So we're rethinking the connections between water and economics. What does it mean to privatize water systems? What are the tools that might be appropriate or might not be appropriate in different places at different times? A lot of discussion in the last 10 years has gone on in that area. There are new technologies, big and small. There are new technologies for big cities to disinfect water supply, innovative ultraviolet technologies, innovative filtration technologies and membrane systems. But there are also some new technologies at the very small scale, small, inexpensive filters that remove arsenic, which is a terrible contamination problem in West Bengal and Bangladesh. Small, inexpensive technologies to let a single farmer in a very poor place implement drip technology that may permit them to move out of a subsistence existence and grow a little more food that maybe all of a sudden they can sell in a marketplace, a local markets that's bringing in income while reducing the amount of water that's required to grow food. Drip technology is no longer a technology only for the industrialized, richer nations of the world. To some degree, there's been a move away from ideology in the water area, a move away from the public-private debate, a move away from the big-small, a move away from the no dams argument, or all of the different ideologies that we hear about in the water area. And it's still there, of course, because it is in every field of endeavor, but there has been some very profitable discussion across sectors and across ideologies that's moving this field forward. So this is a biennial report. It comes out every 2 years. What's new in this one? There's a chapter on water and terrorism. As Jeff mentioned, I've been interested for a long time on the connections between water and conflict. I did work 20 years ago on alternative security, looking at how environment and resources and security are related, and concluded at that time that probably the greatest threat to security, in the broad sense of the word, was not energy, but was water. And have spent a great deal of time thinking about that, and Jeff and I have worked on that in the programs here and elsewhere. Obviously, in the last few years, 10 years ago was pre-9/11. There is a new interest, especially in this aspect of security that is terrorism. And there's a long history of terrorism and connections with water. And in the book, something that's been in the book all 5 times has been a chronology of water-related conflicts going back 3,000 years, where disputes over water led to violence of some form. Water is a tool of conflict, water is a target of conflict, and water and terrorism. This chapter pulls out of that chronology, I think at least 50, maybe 100 examples of water and terrorism since 1700 around the world. And if you're interested in that and what are the risks, what aren't the risks, how might we work to reduce those risks, I urge you to take a look at that chapter. There's a chapter on ecosystems in water, written by David Katz, on the issue of restoration, what it means around the world. How are we and scientists beginning to think about restoring flows, and what does that mean? Desalination. The Pacific Institute did a major study on desalination in the last year. There is a shorter version of this in a chapter in the world's water, looking at the pros and the cons, the costs and the benefits. There are places where desalination makes a lot of sense. There are places where it does not make sense. There are places where it would only make sense if we meet a certain set of criteria and a certain set of principles, and we talk about that. Floods and droughts, the biggest killers in the water area. There's a chapter on the past and the future of floods and droughts. The field of environmental justice has grown enormously in the last decade. That is, what's the connection between environmental issues and equity? And in this particular case, water issues and equity and environmental justice at the international level and at the U.S., in the U.S. There's a chapter on business risks of water. Businesses use water for a lot of different things, and increasingly, those businesses that don't think about how they use water, don't think about the impacts of their water use on local communities, don't adequately treat the water they use before returning it to the local environment, are finding that there's growing opposition to what they do. Sometimes this opposition has a serious, significant economic cost, and more businesses are trying to pay attention to this because a small number of businesses didn't and got burned. And so there's a discussion about how businesses might think about water and how they might integrate water into the things that they do. That chapter also talks about the water sector, the water industry, a $400 or $500 billion a year industry in a lot of different pieces and where it might be going. There are also smaller little vignettes, if you will, little pieces in the world's water, what we call in briefs. We did a chapter on bottled water 2 years ago in the last volume, quite a comprehensive assessment. We've updated that in a short analysis of current trends of sales. There's a discussion about recalls of bottled water in the United States, primarily, in the last 5 or 10 or 15 years. There have been a number of recalls by the FDA. Bottled water is considered a food product. It's regulated by the FDA, whereas our tap water is is regulated by the EPA. And so there are differences in regulations, and under the FDA rules, there are recalls of food products when there's contamination, and some of those have been bottled water recalls. There's a discussion of that. There's an update of the water conflict chronology again, and there's a little piece on the search for water on Mars. We spent a lot of money in the last few years sending missions to Mars to look for water and finding water. And for those of you who have been tracking those little rovers running around on the surface of Mars, that's a truly remarkable technological advance. But what you may not know is that the scientific advance in the understanding of the dynamics of water on Mars have been astounding. We now think we have roughly a 3 to 4 billion year history of water on Mars, including periods of time when rocks were clearly sitting in water, where there was a lot of water. Anyway, there's a discussion of that. And there are a lot of data. If there are any data wonks in the audience, and you're interested in water data, the volumes of the world's water repeat some data sets and update new data sets and offer new data sets on a wide variety of water issues. I'm going to give you some facts and numbers from the world's water, some things that come out of it. I would like to note, though, that as much as I love facts and numbers, I don't want you to lose the human picture here. There are human beings behind all of these facts and numbers, and sometimes it's easy to get lost. It's easy to lose the human part of that, and I would just urge you not to do that. As I said, there are more than 50 incidents of water-related terrorism described in the book. Over half of the accessible fresh water on Earth is estimated to be used, appropriated by humans for something. If you wonder why we're affecting natural ecosystems, this is why. We're a large footprint in the water world. Over half of the wetlands, the natural ecosystems, wetland ecosystems of the world have been lost to some form of development. Either we've built on them, we've filled them in, or we've appropriated the water for them and they've dried up and disappeared. Yet there are efforts to protect and restore ecosystems underway, interesting, innovative, successful stories in more than 70 countries around the world. There are more than 10,000 desalination plants worldwide. Desalination is not a new technology. It's being implemented quite widely. Now, most of these desalination plants are very small. There are a handful of really big ones, but there are some really big ones in the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East, on some islands in the Caribbean that are completely dependent on them for reliable, sustainable water. And there's more and more interest in building them in the U.S. The total global capacity is about 35,000 cubic meters of water every day. It's actually not a lot of water when you think about global demand for water, but in some places it's a vital source of supply. Between 1900 and last year, floods and droughts killed a reported 17 million people worldwide, and lots more in the early parts of those years that were never reported, and affected billions more. Floods and droughts are the big killers in the water world of people. This number, most of you hear a lot if you pay attention in the water world. There are 1 billion people without access to clean drinking water, and there are 2.5 billion people without access to adequate sanitation services. 2.5 billion people is 40% of the world's population. These are people who don't have access to services that were available to the inhabitants of ancient Rome. 2.5 billion people is more people than lived on the planet in 1930 in total, just to put things in a little bit of perspective. Water's a big business. There are a lot of pieces to this. There's the desalination business, there's the bottled water business, but there are the companies that build pipelines or wastewater treatment plants. There are water utilities that own and operate water systems. There are water purification companies that, because the water is so dirty in some parts of the world, will build systems to take water and treat it for industrial use. There are certain industries that require very high quality water coming in. There are other companies that deal with what goes out the other end. Water is a big business and growing very rapidly. Bottled water sales continue to grow worldwide. The data, we have some graphs on that. Although the rate of growth actually slowed a little bit last year. And I'm not sure what that means, if that's a trend or not. One year doesn't make a trend, but it was sort of interesting to see after 10 and 12 and 15% annual growth rates to see it drop quite substantially. And bottled water remains 1,000 times more expensive than high quality tap water. And I'm delighted to see that the Woodrow Wilson Center is serving tap water. I mentioned this already. There have been more than 100 recalls of bottled water in recent years. I said this last night at a little talk I gave, but my favorite one, I think there are 25 or 30 or 50 in the book in a little table, but we're going to post a list shortly on our website of all of them that we've been able to dig up. We actually had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get some of them. But my favorite one was in 1994, a bottled water company in Texas had to recall its product line because they were contaminated with crickets. And so I said that yesterday, and somebody said, well, they put worms in vodka. Maybe there's a business there. I don't know. India produces more than 15% of its food with unsustainable groundwater. That means they're overpumping groundwater. They're pumping it faster than nature recharges it, and groundwater levels are dropping very rapidly. That can't continue indefinitely. 15% of India's food is a significant fraction. What is that going to mean for long-term production? China, in northern China, around Beijing, is limiting water-intensive businesses because of water constraints. You can't get a permit to build a new textile plant around Beijing now because they're too water intensive. That is increasingly a factor in the consideration of businesses around the world. The number of cases of dracunculiasis, guinea worm, has dropped to its lowest level ever reported, from millions of cases in the 70s to a few tens of thousands of cases now, almost all of which are in a very small band in Central Africa, in fact, largely the Sudan. Guinea worm is one of those water-related diseases, of which there are many water-related diseases, but it's one that we actually have the potential to completely eliminate, to wipe off the face of the earth, because we can break the cycle in humans, and humans are a part of the cycle, and if you break the cycle, it's gone. It's something the Carter Center has been working on for a long time. The CDC has been involved in, the United Nations has been involved in. There was hope actually 10 years ago when I was first writing In fact, there's a discussion of guinea worm in the first volume of The World's Water. At that time, there was hope that by the year 2000, it would be gone. That didn't happen, but we're getting there, and I think it's actually going to happen. Another fact, between 1992 and 2001, during a sampling regime at the USGS, pesticides were detected in 97% of all stream samples that were taken. They're ubiquitous in the United States and elsewhere. Pesticides were detected in beverages in India recently, not because the companies are putting pesticides in their beverages, but because there are pesticides in the source water, and they haven't been adequately pre-treated to remove them. So industrial chemicals continues to be a very serious problem for water quality worldwide. It used to be thought in the industrialized nations we've solved the human sanitation problem. We collect our wastes and we treat our water supply mostly. And what we have to worry about is pesticides and industrial chemicals. And in the developing world, the concern is human wastes in the water. But now industrial chemicals are being seen worldwide. It's an increasing problem, not a diminishing problem. And Mars, I've talked about already. So how do we move forward on water? One of the things about the world's water is we've always tried to talk about solutions, not just problems. We've always pushed for understanding what works and what's replicable and what can be expanded in all of the different pieces of the water puzzle. And part of that requires rethinking the world of water. First of all, I get this all the time. I was trained as an engineer as an undergraduate. I understand technology. I understand the desire for a single answer to a problem. But in the water area, there isn't one. 10 years ago, it was privatization. It was a financial tool. It's not the silver bullet, as we've learned in the last 10 years. It's a tool, and it's applicable in certain kinds of places in certain kinds of ways, but it's not a silver bullet. I meant to look up where silver bullet comes from, but somebody knows. Now it's, never mind. Now it's desalination. Well, desalination also has a role to play, but it's not the answer. It's not going to be the answer for a large fraction of the world's population. And so this is a difficult problem. We have to think a little more deeply about solutions in the long run. And there are new approaches out there, but the way we traditionally think about water management and planning, I would argue, have to change. It's not just an engineering question. It's not just an economic question. It's time to bring in a broader set of voices. We have to think differently about what we mean by what is the value of water? What is the concept of supply? In the old days, the value of water was a sort of a narrow economic term, a pricing term often. Supply was a new reservoir, a new dam, a new reservoir, a new groundwater pump into an aquifer. Well, now the value of water is increasingly understood to include social values, political values, not just economic values. The concept of supply is being broadened not just to mean where's the next reservoir, the next dam I can build, or the next river I can take that's a little further away than the one I'm already tapping, but reclaimed wastewater, rainwater harvesting, smart conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, where you recharge aquifers in wet years and then pump them out during dry years. Turns out in California, the best source of new reservoir storage may be underground aquifers that we already have, if we can manage them smartly. We have to think differently about demand for water. What do we really want to do with water? And I'm going to come back to this a little more because it's something I particularly care about. But demand is not inexorable, and it's not inevitable that it's growing, which is an assumption that traditional water managers typically adopt. What works? Why does it work? Where does it work? How can it be scaled up? These are different kinds of questions than were asked 20 years ago or in the 20th century or even 10 years ago in many ways. I love this graph. This is a graph that shows from 1940 to 2050 actual U.S. water withdrawals in this dark blue line, and then each of these little dots is a national projection of water use. And the lines connect the amount of water projected to be used back to the date when the projection was made. So this projection for the year 2000 was made in 1973, actually. So over time, we make projections of water use. They're almost always too high, grossly too high. Now, this one here was actually made in 1999, very, very recent, relatively speaking. It's actually the most recent national water projection that has been made. And it actually shows a little bit more accurately a sense of what's actually been happening in the United States. And that is, we've moved away from inevitable significant increases in water use. And in fact, if this scale were cut off here, this is a very big increase in water use since 1940. And I'll show you a graph in a moment going back to 1900. But in 1980, we actually stopped increasing demand for water. This is total water withdrawals in the United States for everything. And in fact, we use less water today than we used 20 years ago. That concept is completely radical to traditional water planners. We have a much higher population than we had 20 years ago. We have a much stronger economy than we had 20 years ago, but we're using less water for everything. And so these projections, these forecasts of future water use, really the big ones, reflect the traditional thinking about water. The idea that as population grows, as economies grow, we're going to have to take more and more water from the environment. We don't. And if you leave the room with anything today, leave it with that idea, that the demand for water is not inexorably growing, or doesn't have to. I would note this is pretty close to all of the water the United States has on a renewable basis. Not quite, but we couldn't possibly have gotten here, even if we had wanted to. Okay. So things are changing if you look back over the last few years. Our traditional understanding of the true costs of traditional supply is part of the reason that curve has leveled off, what I call the hard path for water. It's partly leveled off because it's become harder and harder to build a new big dam in the United States. There aren't that many places to build them anymore where somebody isn't going to find a value that they care for more. And in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we had some pretty serious, vociferous debates at the political level here about some big new dams that were proposed, for example, to flood the Grand Canyon. Those proposals existed, to build dams to fill what's called the North American Trench, a 500-mile-long valley in northern western Canada with the Yukon and the Mackenzie and the big rivers up there, and pipe that water all the way east to the Great Lakes region and all the way south to Mexico. We can't do that anymore. And so we understand the economic costs of that approach, the political costs, the environmental costs, and that's one of the reasons why these curves are changing. But along with that, that's sort of the don't do this point of view. But the other more positive reason is that along with that, we've discovered that we can do the things we want to do with less water. What it's all about, and this gets back to this demand question, and some of you have heard me say this, but we don't want to use water except for drinking, for some vital things. We want to produce goods and services. We want to grow food. We want to make semiconductors. We want to build automobiles. We want to communicate. We want to do things. Lots of those things require water. Some require a lot of water. But all of them, maybe I should qualify that, but I'm not going to. All of them, I would argue, we could probably do with less. I did qualify it. We could probably do with less water than we're currently using. We could grow more food with less water. We can and are producing semiconductors with less water than we did 10 years ago. We can make clothing with less water. We can do what we want to do with less water. And so the demand for water is also tied to the processes we use and the assumptions we make and the technologies we implement, the efficiency of use. We used to spend 6 gallons every time we flush our toilets. The national standard, and maybe I shouldn't call it a standard, now is 1.6 gallons per flush. And the best toilets on the market, actually, from a water point of view, the best toilets on the market use 0 water, and the Swedes are working hard in that area. But the best toilets on the water now use 1.3 gallons per flush. They're dual flush toilets. They're standard in Singapore. They're the law in Australia. They're in common use in Japan. We don't want to use a lot of water. We want to do things. The nature of our economy is changing. A lot of what we're doing today in our economy is less water intensive per dollar of income than it used to be 20 years ago. More services, more telecommunications, more electronics, less steel manufacturing, less heavy metals refining of oil, things that are more water intensive per dollar of GNP. And so the nature of our economy is changing as well. And for that reason, this bottom line, this solid line, is that same water line, the total water withdrawals in the United States that I showed you a minute ago, although it goes back to 1900 here. So you can see we've actually increased almost tenfold our use of water in the United States in the last 100 years. But it's leveled off, and it's gone down. It's gone down enormously on a per capita basis. But this other line is the gross national product of the United States, and it shows what economists love to see, that inevitable exponential growth. But our economy is changing. We're producing more dollars with less water. If you divide these two and get dollars per unit water, our productivity of water use has gone way, way up, our economic productivity of water use. And I just think that's great news. I think that's really great news. And you see the same curve bending over in China and in Europe and in a lot of other places. Some other changes. Congress passed and the President signed the Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act to try to get U.S. efforts in the international aid arena to focus more on water. There isn't really any money in it. There's reallocations from one hand to another. But it is, I don't want to be too critical because that's politics, but it was a serious bipartisan positive effort to raise the level of awareness about water issues and to raise a level of awareness about the responsibility of the United States. We play an important role worldwide. We could play a much better, more important, bigger role in the water area worldwide, and I'm not going to get into that. I got into that 2 years ago. But the Water for the Poor Act was a step, I think, in the right direction in education and ultimately in action. There's going to be a new direction in Congress. I don't know what direction it's going to go. I don't know if the Democrats care any more about water than the Republicans. It's not a red-blue kind of an issue. But there is interest in Congress in water. There's new but uncertain foundation interest in water. There's some new players. There's uncertainty about what direction those organizations are going to go in, but there are other sources of money and interest and expertise that are developing. There's a growing involvement of new kinds of participants, and Jay-Z and Matt Damon and Bono, and there's the celebrity side of things. There are new financial institutions getting involved and new mechanisms. There are new innovative partnerships cutting across traditional boundaries, government, non-government, left, right. There are really some interesting things going on. All of that's good because water is such a difficult and important issue. I want to close with a couple of comments about the role of science in policy. In part, because the Pacific Institute has a new project on the integrity of science. And because a lot of what we do is water-related, for those of you who don't know, I'm the director of the Pacific Institute. It's a nonprofit research institute in Oakland. And the Institute's project is to look at the way science and policy interact, and sometimes interact badly. Good policy without good science and analysis is not impossible. You can get good policy without good analysis, but it's less likely. I would argue that good policy with bad science is even more unlikely. And so the integrity of science is key. And I raise this in the context of what I feel is a disturbing, this is a personal comment, a disturbing trend about the cynical nature of the world we live in. There's been a lot of loss of faith in some very important institutions in the last few years, in the media, in politicians. Corporations have their own perception, public perception problems. The universities, and increasingly science. These are core institutions for the United States. They need to be respected. They need to behave in a way that brings respect. But they're not, all too often the respect for some of these organizations is diminishing. And in the science area especially, as if we lose faith in the scientific process and the voice of scientists who are already reluctant to talk to the public, first of all, because they don't think some of them think it's not their job, or they don't know how, or they're vilified by one side or another, or their universities don't provide resources for it. It's a difficult thing for scientists already to speak to the public. If that gets worse, I think it diminishes our chance of solving problems. And recent experience has been disheartening. And so we have a project to look at, in an analytical way, how you think about the integrity of science. And on the left side, I've offered a couple of examples of some of the challenges in this area that are called logical fallacies, and there's a whole literature about this. On the right side, some abuses of science. But on the left side, for example, we get arguments from ignorance, for arguments just based on a lack of evidence. Another category is arguments from error, arguments just based on the wrong, arguments that are just wrong. There are arguments from ideology, and of course we see a lot of this. We've seen it through history, but there are many examples. Lots of categories. Personal belief. I believe this, and so I don't really care what the evidence says. I just don't believe. I have a personal belief in something, and so that's an argument. Or personal incredulity. I don't believe. That can't possibly be right because of something that I hold in my head. I don't care what the evidence is. It must be wrong. Arguments from tradition, that this isn't the way we've done things in the past, and so, or this isn't what my peer group believes traditionally, and so I make that an argument from that point of view. Arguments from consensus. Global climate change is not a real problem because the majority of scientists believe it's a problem. That's a mistaken argument. The majority of scientists believe it's a problem because the evidence says it is. So don't make the argument from consensus, make the argument from science. And plenty of people on the left say, look, there are only a small number of skeptics out there. 1,000 climate scientists, and I'm trained in climatology, so I fall into this trap sometimes too, believe, because the IPCC says it, that climate change is a real problem, and so policymakers ought to act on it. They could still be wrong. I don't think they're wrong, but the argument is not true because everyone believes it's true in any field. Lots of people thought the sun went around the Earth. And there was an argument from ideology in 1633 when the church banned Galileo's writings. On the other side, we have abuses of science, appeals to emotion, personal attacks. And we've seen a lot of of ad hominem attacks. So a scientist making an argument, a scientific argument is not wrong because the person making the argument is stupid or different or whatever. He might still be wrong, or she might still be wrong, but not because of an attack on their personality or their personal, on the person themselves. Straw man arguments we see all the time. Misuses of fact, misuses of uncertainty. There are things that we know that are misused. Sometimes what we don't know is misused in this area. Falsification and suppression of information. Manipulation of the scientific process. Who you appoint to scientific review panels is important. Selective funding of science or selective defunding of science, and in this town, that one may be familiar, is always a challenge. There are lots of categories. This is just a little sense of the project we're doing at the Institute. We're trying to focus on water. We're doing some work on climate change. We're not dealing with the evolution debate. That's not our expertise, and there are plenty of people working on that. But there are lots of pieces of this puzzle. It has been fodder for the political cartoonists. This is an example of suppression of information, selective choice or use of data. This is Tom Tolles, a Washington Post political cartoonist, who is quite a remarkably, he's really on this issue. I hope you can all read it. It's a George Bush cartoon about suppression of information or selective use of information. There are arguments from error. And this is an example I like to use in talks I give on global warming. This is a photograph from the Mississippi River in 2000. As some of you know, there was a 1 in a 500-year flood. Hydrologically, a severe flood, as severe as one would expect to get statistically, once every 500 years. 7 years before, in 1993, there was another 1 in a 500-year flood on the Mississippi River. Now, some say evidence of climate change. Well, maybe. I don't know. It's possible to have 2 1 in a 500-year floods 2 years in a row and not have another one for 1,000 years and still statistically be perfectly normal. And maybe that's what's going on. And so when I talk about that, as I'm trying to do today, I don't say this is evidence of climate change. I do say it makes hydrologists really, really nervous. And it makes water managers nervous, as it should. And it makes us do the right thing, I hope, and that is rethink floodplain management and planning and levee design and all of the things that we then experienced again in Katrina. Here's another cartoon from Dilbert on fabrication and falsification of data. According to my benchmark tests, our product is the worst one on the market. And the pointy-haired boss says, maybe you can tweak the numbers. Fake them, she says, and he says, fake is such an ugly word. But this is a challenge in many of the fields, in business and politics and science, about the numbers. Some final thoughts. The water problem is real and it's bad. But not everything is bad. It's not getting worse everywhere. There are positive things out there. There are human, economic, and environmental costs to inaction, and that means we need to do things a little bit differently. There are some new principles that ought to be applied. We ought to look at a diversity of solutions. We ought to look at the proper application of economics and science. Public participation is critical. Decisions can no longer be made by a small set of water agency people. The most effective water projects are those where the public's involved from the beginning. We have to integrate, not ignore, environmental factors. We need new thinking. What solutions in the long run are going to be sustainable, scalable, and socially responsible? A lot's happened in 10 years. Not enough has happened in 10 years. We need information. We need good science. We need good integration of science and policy. We need good education. But ultimately, it's got to be information to education to action. Thank you very much.
stand or sit, whichever you prefer.
Up to you.
Well, we'll take some questions. I ask that when you pose them, you let us know who you are, and also that you use a microphone. We are, as I should have mentioned when we started, webcasting this event live, and then the video will also be archived on the website along with Peter's slides, hopefully, if he'll let us, as well as a summary of the meeting and some other links to things such as radio interviews he's done here at the center and the like. So please, who would like to kick us off? Lewis, down here.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much for that. The graph of the U.S., the one you said we should remember, don't remember anything else. Have you taken that and tried to project what that looks like for the developing world? Because you had mentioned that India is producing 15% of its food from unsustainable water resources. What does it look like for a country like India?
Yeah, let me say two things about that. First of all, I'm going to put in a plug here for the U.S. Geological Survey. The data on water use in the United States come from a series of reports produced by the U.S. Geological Survey on water use. They are the most comprehensive, every 5-year reports on how the U.S. is using water by sector, by state, by watershed. It's underfunded. It's always in danger, that series of water use reports. But without those water use reports, we wouldn't have any sense of these sorts of dynamics. And so part of the answer to your question is that other countries in the world don't collect water use data. We don't do it perfectly by any means, but lots of them don't do it at all. Some of them do it periodically but not consistently. Some of them do it with different methods from one year to another. And so in some places it's difficult to get good long-term sense of how water use is happening at all or even changing over time. I did mention China is beginning to break that curve. China does have water use data over a certain period. Other countries do. And I've collected a lot of those data. A lot of them have been in various volumes of the World's Water and some other publications of mine. India doesn't have very good long-term water use data. So the first part of the question is we don't have a very clear picture of the trends of water use over time. But the other part of the answer is that most developing countries are here on the curve. Their water use is going up, and it's got to go up. They're building infrastructure. Their people don't have the water in the urban areas that they need. Industry is growing and expanding. Agriculture is sometimes growing and expanding. And so, in part, many of those countries are on the up curve still. Demand for water overall is growing. But in all of the countries of the world, we can do more with less water. In India, groundwater is very heavily overpumped. It's heavily overpumped because effectively groundwater is free to the farmers because the government subsidizes electricity or provides free electricity for agricultural pumps. So the cost of pumping groundwater is the cost of buying a pump. And then lots of those pumps run 24 hours a day. And so they don't have an incentive to move to more efficient irrigation technologies, for example. I think India could grow a lot more food with less water, with an investment in irrigation efficiency technology or a change in government policy on subsidies or how you tackle those problems or policy questions, and they're economic questions and they're questions of equity, and they're not always easy, but I think they're solvable. Mexico City replaced 250,000 leaky toilets 10 years ago with efficient toilets and saved enough water to meet the entire water needs of 350,000 residents of Mexico City. So even in developing countries, there are inefficiencies. Even as we're trying to provide more water, governments are trying to provide more water, NGOs are trying to provide more water for certain kinds of uses, we could do it more efficiently. And so both of those things have to happen at the same time.
Okay, Scott?
Yes, I have a question regarding the human aspect that you mentioned a moment ago. Can you give us a preview of what you're going to say tonight in New York with your 2 minutes to that audience?
Yes, I could probably tell you entirely what I'm saying, because my answers to questions sometimes ramble on for 2 minutes. Very briefly, first of all, they asked me to speak, I think, because it's an MTV event. There's an MTV documentary, but it's a UN event too, and I think they wanted a little bit of some substance of the nature of the problem and solutions. So I'm going to talk about very briefly the problem, the failure to provide water supply and sanitation for billions of people, the potential political risks of conflicts over water, the destruction of ecosystems because of human use. I'm then going to say that there are solutions, and that there are lots of solutions, and that the solutions are technical and economic and social and political, and that they require the action of individuals. It's going to be an audience it's going to be a really diverse audience. It's going to be people who don't know anything about water and people who know a lot about water. And I think the idea is to say, look, as individuals, there are things we can do to understand where our water comes from and where it goes, to get involved in our local communities in water issues, to get involved as groups. We all participate in groups of different kinds as communities, to get involved as governments. That more money ought to be spent, more brains ought to be applied, more technology ought to be disseminated, and that if all of those things happen, I think I'm going to try and say that there's an opportunity to solve these problems. There you go.
Okay, gentlemen, just right in front, and then we'll come down here.
Hi, I'm Michael Brody. If you looked at a map of energy forecasts and actual energy use, it would be very similar to what you have, and the change point's about the same year. And
yes. Yes.
We'd like you to maybe talk about why and what the relations are.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and it's not entirely a coincidence. Two things really happened in the 1970s that ultimately led to this breaking of the water curve and the energy curve. The first thing was, and this was, I guess, in the late 60s, or the Cuyahoga River caught fire and the U.S. woke up. There was a proposal to build a dam that would have flooded the Grand Canyon. There was a growing awareness about water in the 60s, and we passed the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and as part of that, there was a new requirement that industries couldn't just dump untreated industrial wastes into rivers, and cities couldn't dump untreated sewage into rivers. And so a great deal of money started to be spent at looking at how we used water. And for the industrial sector, it turned out that the best way to reduce the cost of industrial wastewater treatment was to reduce the amount of water industries had to treat. And so they actually weren't trying to save water, they were trying to save money in order to clean up their processes. That's part of it. And so water use in industry went down, and so that was part of it. Energy costs went way up. There are very close connections between water and energy. It takes a lot of water to produce energy for cooling. We're actually still moving away toward eliminating once-through cooling systems. It takes a lot of energy to move and treat and heat water for use. And so as energy costs went up, the cost of water also went up, and the cost of a lot of other processes went up. And so as we moved to improve efficiency, energy wasn't the only beneficiary. And so there was a corollary effect on a whole series of water uses as well. And so that's also part of the story behind these curves. I'm going to have to write an article about the curves because they're really interesting and there's a lot going on in them.
Hi, I'm Catherine Brown, a science writer and editor, and my question is this. You talked about how we're doing more with less water and that there's progress being made, technological trends, local efficiencies, that kind of thing. My question is, can you give me a sense for where the most progress is being made, or highlight a few of the bigger bits of progress, if you will, and also looking ahead, speak to what are the major goals that need to be met next in order to kind of continue this progress? I know it's multifaceted, but can you hit a few of those highlights?
Sure. Is the where question a place question or a sectoral use kind of a question? Okay. The greatest progress, and is it a U.S. question or an international question? Okay. The greatest progress in the water use efficiency area has been in urban uses, residential, commercial, industrial, and what we call institutional. In part because the price that urban water users pay for water is much higher than agricultural water users pay. So I'm much more willing as an individual to buy something that reduces my water use because it's going to save me more money than maybe a farmer might, which is one of the challenges. In addition, there's another driver to the urban sector changes, and that is in the United States, we passed a law in 1992, the 1992 Energy Policy Act. Embedded in that act are some water efficiency standards that required new technology in the residential sector and in the commercial sector that drove some technological innovations. There has also been, even without standards, technological innovation in the industrial sector and so on. So there's been a lot of progress on the technology side, on the regulation side, and on the pricing side that have led to improvements in efficiency. Now, and that's true also internationally. There's been more attention to leaks, fixing leaks. We spend a lot of money capturing water, treating it to a high standard, putting it in pipes, and then it leaks, and we never get to use it. And it's cheap to replace those leaks. The agricultural sector is a tougher nut to crack, and it's more important in some ways because 80% of the world's water that humans take is consumed by the agricultural sector. So it's important that more effort go into that area. Now, we are improving the water productivity of agriculture. We're producing more food with less water. We've moved extensively away from flood irrigation toward sprinklers, away from sprinklers toward high precision, low energy sprinklers, away from those toward drip irrigation. Each of those is an improvement in efficiency. We get to grow more food with less water. Now, there's different kinds of crops require different kinds of irrigation. It's, you have to be careful here. But we could do much more in the agricultural area. We could grow much more food with much less water. And I actually think if I were focusing on something new, and we are, is I would try and work in that area because it has the greatest potential in terms of magnitude of impact, and I think it potentially has the greatest potential for human well-being in developing countries, especially. I mentioned briefly drip irrigation. Did I do that? The idea that a small farmer now can afford a little inexpensive drip system that they fill with a bucket every day that waters their garden and is able to grow more food than they need for their home use and go to a market and sell it and make little income is a huge change in quality of life at a very local level. And there are more and more examples like that.
Terrific. How about some, why don't we, Karen, you're right down there, so why don't we get this one, then we'll move to the back, so you don't have to run around.
I'm Sylvia Tognetti. I'm an environmental science and policy consultant. I write the Flows Bulletin. Your talk about policies is focused primarily on doing more with less than on efficiency, and it seems that leveling off of the curve is primarily driven by limits on developing new supply and the willingness to take those, to enact those kind of policies. And what I'm not seeing here is any discussion of capping use so that you can take a more proactive approach. If you want to have water for environmental uses, you probably need to have a cap. Otherwise, it's just going to, even if you increase efficiency, when we increased efficiency of automobiles, we started building SUVs. So I'm afraid of the same thing in water. So if you have looked at the use of caps or where they have worked, I'd be interested to hear that.
Okay, Peter, why don't we take a couple because we're starting to come to the end of the time. I want to make sure everyone. So, Karen, if we could go all the way back to Mary and then Andra in the middle. Sean, if you could give the mic to Andra in the middle, then we'll get her after Mary.
Yes, my name is Mary Mullen. I was just curious as to, you said the Swedes were going to work with toilets with no water. I'm just curious if you could talk about how that is done.
Sure.
Terrific. And Andra?
Hi. I was wondering, Does the Pacific Institute, since you're great data wonks over there, have you put together any kind of data set that a person can go to and look at food choices or clothing choices, and you can make a choice to choose less water-intensive food choices or clothing technology, etc.? So doing something similar to what they're doing with carbon footprints, lessening our water footprints.
Okay.
Great, Chris, why don't you take those three?
Let me go backwards. That's a great idea. We've thought about that, of doing some kind of water calculator. Carbon calculators, carbon footprint calculators are increasingly common. We haven't found the resources to do such a thing, but it would be fun to do. I have thought about, for example, writing a little essay about how much water is in your breakfast, depending on what you eat. Somebody did that recently for energy, and the water implications are actually more interesting, I think. But there are water implications of every daily choice we make, and we'd love to do that kind of thing, but haven't. So it's a great idea. There's a long history of composting toilets, waterless toilets. In the United States and in Western Europe, we went to the system where we get rid of our wastes by contaminating a huge amount of water. It's a great, convenient system, but it's a really dumb idea if water quality and water availability are problems, as they are. The rest of the world is not going to solve the sanitation problem with flush toilets. We can't afford it. It's too expensive. The water's not available. It's just not going to happen. And so there are lots of sanitation options out there, many options, some of which are better than others. But composting toilets is something the Swedes are interested in. They call it eco-sanitation. They're interested in it from a research point of view and from a practical point of view. A colleague of mine at the Pacific Institute put in a composting toilet. He has 2 toilets in his house. One's an ultra-low-flow toilet, and one's a composting toilet. Now, there's a little trade-off there. You're trading water actually for energy. It takes a little bit of energy to run this it's a Swedish toilet. But there are options out there that are, as I say, no water alternatives. And I'm not saying the United States is going to go to composting toilets. We won't. Or maybe someday. But it is an idea that there are other alternatives that we could look at. The idea of caps is an interesting one. First of all, I don't think this curve is broken primarily because of constraints on supply. It's a factor. We're having trouble finding places to build new big dams, but that's not really what's going on here. It really is a combination of constraints on supply, but also innovative industrial efficiency improvements, because that's the smarter thing and easier thing to do. It's hard to put a cap on supply or use because of political issues, but there are places around the world where it's been done. And the best example I can give is the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. The Murray-Darling River is the largest river in Australia. It goes through, I think, almost all of the major states of Australia, from Queensland down to Victoria. It's very heavily used by agriculture and by cities, and it's overused. A few years ago, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission of Australia placed a cap on new withdrawals from the Murray-Darling. They said no more. We can't afford to take any more out. And in fact, we're going to figure out a way, once you have a cap, you can then figure out a way to reduce use, which is a debate going on in the climate area. We're going to figure out how to restore ecosystem flows at critical periods. We're going to work with farmers and the cities together to decide how to implement the cap, what it means. And it's a difficult thing politically, but they're working through it, and it's a good example. And maybe the other example is South Africa, that has said, they haven't placed a cap, but they've said, when they threw out apartheid and rewrote their constitution, we're going to rethink our water laws. And the prime water is going to be committed for human use, for basic human needs, and natural ecosystems. And it's not a lot of water, but that's what they call their reserve. That's first. After that, we'll discuss what's left and how to allocate it. And it's been a very innovative discussion, and some really interesting things are going on there. And we've written about it in some previous volumes of The World's Water as well. But those may be good examples for you.
Okay, I have a question down here, and then we come over to these gentlemen.
Keely Lang. You mentioned in your comments you intend to make in New York the connection between water and conflict. And I have two questions stemming from that. One is, do you see that as violent conflict? And two, navigating peace, and a lot of what SCAP is doing revolves around shared resources, especially water resources, as a source of peace building. How do you see the water as a source of conflict conflicting with water as a source of cooperation?
I'm not going to say tonight anything more than I think I've already said about that issue. I really don't have much time, and they don't really want me to go on and on. But I do think there are very close connections between water and security. And I think of security in the broadest sense, and conflict in the broadest sense. In the work we've done in the world's water, and the regular update of the chronology, and the articles and the chapters we've written about water and conflict, and the work that I've done with Jeff, I do focus on violent conflict because it's a big word. And it can encompass a lot. You can have we have political conflict over water all the time, and that's interesting too, and difficult. And I'm interested in that. But on the security side, I'm interested in violent conflict over water. And so the examples in the chronology focus on violence. They're not always interstate. Increasingly, in fact, they're intrastate. They're neighbor to neighbor. They're political boundary to political boundary, but not across international boundaries. And I'm also a firm believer that water and cooperation are closely linked. I've worked a lot with Aaron Wolf, as has Jeff, on how water and conflict and cooperation work together. We did some projects in the Middle East on cooperation over water. We held a workshop at the Vatican on water and conflict, a remarkable meeting. We've done work in Central America and Central Asia on this issue. So I do believe water ultimately could be an enormous source of cooperation, and typically is. But there is a risk of conflict and violence, and a long history of conflict and violence over water, when we don't figure out how to turn it to cooperation. Sometimes the root cause is religion or ethnic violence or boundaries or economics, and water is a subcomponent of the debate. But understanding the dynamics is key to understanding the solutions. And there's been a lot written about it, but maybe that's all I should say.
You said that some parts of Bob Olson, you said that some parts of the United States are starting to look at desalination. And with new technologies, when does it make sense to think about desalination?
That's another great question. The biggest problem with desalination is its cost. It's very expensive. And it's very expensive compared to other sources of high-quality municipal water that we already pay a lot for. It's even expensive compared to high-quality industrial water in most places. So the short answer is desalination makes sense when it's economically competitive with the alternatives available to whoever is looking at the alternatives. Now, there are environmental and social costs of desalination. It's not a purely clean technology. You have to deal with brine. You have to deal with chemicals that are used to treat the filters, the membranes, if you're using reverse osmosis. It's not a panacea. Now, I think those things are solvable. Whether they'll be solved is partly a local regulatory question. It's partly an economic question. It's partly a technological question. The technology is improving. There's a new big desalination plant that was planned for Tampa Bay, Florida, one of the biggest in the world. The promoters said it was going to be incredibly cheap. It's been a real disappointment. It's still not operating. It's many years late now. It's much more expensive than the promoters said. There have been bankruptcies involved. It's a scandal in many ways. It's gone through different hands. I think it's going to open. It's opening for testing very shortly, in the next month or two. I hope they can make it run, and I hope they find it economic. I wish them the best of luck, but I think they're going to be paying a lot of money for it, more than they expected. There are 20 plants proposed for the coast of California right now, big ones and little ones, including some really big ones. We did a big report on them at the Pacific Institute a few months ago. It's on our website for free on the pros and cons. There are some significant potential advantages, but I'd be surprised if any of the big ones are actually built because there are still cheaper alternatives. It's cheaper to conserve water. It's cheaper to figure out smart transfers from agricultural users. It's cheaper to treat wastewater a little bit more and use it for certain kinds of end uses. So desalination is in our future. It's important in many parts of the world, but it's not going to be common for a while.
Okay. We have down here, and then I thought there was another one in the middle.
Nancy Colleton. In your closing remarks, you talked about the need for more information or better information. If you were advising the United States on what to do next in the area of information collection on water, what would the priorities be?
Oh, boy. Well, the water use program ought to be hugely expanded and permanently funded. It's the more we know about how we use water and where we use it and what quality we need, the better placed we're going to be to make smart decisions about doing things differently. The water quality information that we collect is limited and inconsistent. We ought to be monitoring water quality. We ought to be expanding water quality monitoring hugely, and those data ought to be online, and they ought to be real time to the extent possible. Part of one of the outcomes of 9/11 has been more concern about water quality and security. There are some new technologies coming along in terms of real-time water quality monitoring that, when they're expanded enough, could potentially be cheap enough so that we could put water quality monitors everywhere for groundwater quality, for surface water quality, not just our drinking water safety. So much more water quality stuff. We're closing gauging stations, not expanding gauging stations that measure water flow, precipitation stations. Snow stations in the West we're closing at a time when climate change is beginning to explicitly affect our snowpack in the western United States. We're going the wrong way on the data side for a country that is rich enough to do the right thing on data. And what we do is far better than what many other countries do. And so internationally, things are even worse.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there for time's sake, but I urge you to follow up with Peter, certainly follow up on the Wilson Center website for resources capturing his talks here, and of course, avail yourself of the book out front. And thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate it, as usual.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, that was some good Lewis.